will start again for the third lecture. And so we talked already a bit about interactions, and this lecture will focus on vertical interactions and feedbacks. So interactions are what connects species, and here we will define an interaction as the impact of one species on the abundance of another species. And we can categorize interaction into three kinds. So exploitation, which is a plus-minus interactions, mutualism, plus-plus interactions, and competition, minus-minus interactions. So exploitation are positive-negative interactions. They typically arise between species that are distinct, so prey and predator or parasites. It includes predation, herbivory, parasitism, and it is the most easily quantifiable. And many ecologists appear centered. So all network theory, food chain, everything is centered on positive-negative interactions. Then mutualism is a positive-positive interaction. Some people are working on facilitation of mutualism here, if I remember well the flash talks. And this is often between species that are distinct. It includes pollinations, dispersing, ectomycorrhiza. It is harder to measure, and it gained focus in recent decades. And so finally, there is competition, which are negative-negative interactions. Often between species that are similar, I mean more or less similar, we think that those are similar, but it includes direct competition, such as fighting, and many other indirect forms. And it is strongly tied to the question of coexistence and biodiversity, and this will be the focus of lecture 4. So today we will talk mostly about plus-minus interactions and a bit about mutualism interactions. And we will leave the competition interaction for tomorrow. Mathieu will talk about that in more details. So Arnaud just explained the niche concept this morning. And so he made clear that this is a one-way view of the interactions. So if we look at the interaction between the mosquitoes and the car, this is an extreme case, obviously. But here, the car has a huge impact on the mosquitoes, but the mosquitoes don't really impact the car. And there is no feedback. And if you look at the frog and its nurse species, so apparently, maybe, I mean, the frog here cannot live without the nurse species. Maybe the frog has an impact on the nurse species, but it is quite negligible compared to the impact of the nurse species on the frog.
What would you classify the car one?
Sorry?
The car example, what would you classify that as?
Well, here, for instance, we could we could say that there is a correlation between the number of cars and the abundance of mosquitoes. Like, where there are more cars, there are less mosquitoes. Like, we could apply the niche concept, but it's just a one-way interaction.
I mean, like, would you consider it competition, or?
No, more predation, because it's, yeah, I would say. Well, no, because it doesn't increase the...
Yeah, I think it's just defining the niche of requirements of mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Not very many cars.
So, yeah, it's not predation, but yeah, it's more like, as if they were fighting. It's a competition.
Very one-sided.
Yeah, very one-sided, that's the thing. And so today, well, now we will wander and we will look at when the one-way view that we talked about in the niche concept doesn't apply. So when feedbacks are important. And basically, feedbacks are important when a species modifies its own conditions, and so we will talk about the mechanisms, the models, and show some results of when a species modifies its conditions. So if we will start with one species alone first, just to understand the notion of feedback clearly, and then we will go to interactions. So if we take one species with an exponential growth, basically here another conditions are captured in fixed growth rate. So if we plot here the net growth rate of the species according to its abundance, Here it doesn't vary with abundance, it is fixed. Okay. But if we now model the dynamic of the species with the logistic growth, here we have n according to t, and so here the equilibrium here implies a slowdown of growth. So as the population grows, it creates worse conditions for itself, and the net growth rate decreases. So if we plot here again the net growth rate according to the abundance, here it's not constant as in the exponential growth, but there is a decrease of the net growth rate. And so here, this decrease is the negative feedback on the species on itself. And so this is really what we call the feedback. So how modifying the conditions feedbacks on the species. So here, just for one species alone, there is already a negative feedback. And we can... Question? No? So Mathieu showed that there are different ways of writing the same equations. And so basically, if we take the RNA formulation here, we will have the coefficient A here, which is the slope of the curve, which is a negative feedback. And so at equilibrium, n equals k, which equals r over a. And so the feedback A here connects the short-term growth rate r to the long-term dynamics, so to the equilibrium k. And this coefficient here, A, is what we call self-regulation. So now I'm going to give some examples of how what can create this negative feedback for one species on itself. So this is, I will then explain a bit more like what is self-regulation, but here this is really a direct self-regulation. So basically it arises when high density or abundance is not a good thing, and it leads to either an increased mortality or a decrease in growth. And basically, one classical example is cannibalism, so intraspecific predation. So you know that lions, for instance, they eat the cubs of other males. And there is also territoriality, so foxes are very territorial animals, so the more abundant they are, there is a decrease in growth. And there is also growth limitation as direct self-regulation, so basically competition for light, for trees, self-thinning, or social inhibition of breeding. And so we can categorize, we can classify dynamics by the sign and the delay of this feedback. So the examples that we show here, there was negative feedback. So here, if the feedback is, has no delay and is negative, this is typically stabilizing, such as in the logistic equation. But if the feedback is positive here, so here we have a plus instead of the minus, this can lead to a run-over process. And if the feedback is negative but with a delay, here, this can lead to cycles or chaos. So we show already examples of when the feedback is direct and negative, and now I will give a few examples of when the feedback is positive and delayed, and negative and delayed. So basically, self-facilitation leads to a positive feedback, and this can lead to run-over processes. For instance, humans with technology, our population size increases faster than an exponential growth. And this can be illustrated by this snowball. So basically a snowball, when you start rolling, it will just increase till maybe it explodes or until it becomes really, really big. But actually, the snowball cannot last forever. And so most run-over processes, they don't last forever. They're often seen in transition between different states. So basically, just for short times during regime shift or regime stability. So here we have kelp forest, so the cover, percentage cover in kelp forest and seaweed turf. And so here we have a lot of kelp forest and almost no seaweed turf. And here we have a runner process that will shift the state to seaweed turf. There is no kelp forest anymore. So if there are multiple stable states, and if the system is pushed enough, then we have jumps between the different equilibrium via a runner process. So a classical example is of such facilitation is alley effect. Do you know what is an alley effect? Yeah, we talked a bit about it, actually. So basically, it's when being more abundant gives an advantage to the species. So when they form herds, like zebra or mammals, herbivores, they can form herds. And for water, for instance, plants sometimes they can bring more water for themselves. And so in the case of a negative feedback, we have -a here, which is the slope, and in case of an alley effect, we first have a positive feedback here, and then the negative feedback again. And so if the alley effect is strong, Seb explained that already yesterday, we have two stable states, either the population is extinct, either it is at current capacity, and here this equilibrium is unstable.
Just to make sure, if anyone needs clarification on this kind of graphs.
Yeah, this is again the growth rate according to the abundance. So here it is being more abundant increase your growth rate, so it's an advantage for the species until a point where it becomes again disadvantageous, and there is a negative feedback.
Was it modeled the same way yesterday, the effect, or was it different?
I think it was the same way.
Yeah, it was written in a different way, but basically if you just multiply by n on the right hand side and you factorize, then you have the same.
So maybe the question, so can you explain a little bit more the difference between strong and weak alley effect?
Yeah, so here the growth is positive anyway, because R is above 0. But here it is negative. So here the population is extinct basically, and you can, as abundance grows, you go over 0. So then the species can survive. Okay.
Yes. So I guess the point.
Yeah.
The point is that in the case of the strong alley effect, if you have a small population below this crossing point here,
cannot survive.
It cannot survive because the growth rate is negative. Total growth rate is still negative, so it will go back to 0.
Whilst here, for the same small population, it can survive. It will increase until negative feedback. But here, it cannot survive until it becomes abundant enough so that it can survive and it can go to the equilibrium K, the other equilibrium.
So if I understand correctly, so strong alley effect. So the main point is strong alley effect enables the population to move from an unsustainable point to where it can survive.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then
whereas with the effects, the population would grow anyway. Just grows a bit faster at the start, but it would grow anyway. So it is always sustainable.
Yeah. So here, oops, sorry. Yeah, here you don't have the two. I mean, with the weak alley effect, you don't have the two equilibrium. Yeah? And so here is an example of direct self-competition, but with delay. So this can lead to cycles of chaos, and basically it arises when juveniles compete with adults. So the juveniles are, the adults are last year's juvenile, and so there's a competition. So if you have classes, age classes for instance, then you can have a competition between the classes, then you can have cycles. So it's the same species, but there is a delay in the feedback because the juvenile will grow and become the adults. But the thing is that usually species are not alone. There are other species with themselves, and so there are other species, and so the feedback can go through other species. Okay, and it's basically the same, the same mechanisms, but here with two species. So if there is, for instance, here a predator and a virus, if there is a negative feedback of the predator on itself, this is stabilizing. So here the predator has a positive impact on the virus, but the virus has a negative impact on the predator. And so the predator, by increasing the virus, will have a negative feedback on itself. And so if the feedback is negative, this is stabilizing here. If it is positive, so with a plus-plus interaction, it leads to a runaway process. And if it is negative but with a delay, so for instance through a prey, so here there's no delay because the dynamics of the virus is fast. So the feedback, so it will feedback quickly on the predator, but with the prey, for which the dynamic is slower, there is a delay. And this can lead to cycles or chaos. So basically, an easy way to remember is just that plus minus makes a minus, plus plus makes a plus, and plus minus makes a minus. Okay. And so we'll give examples of question.
Isn't the plus from predators to virus?
Yeah, the arrows are like
minus to...
Yeah. Yeah, it's a plus of the proton on the virus.
Okay.
Yeah, the arrows are in the wrong direction for the first graph, actually.
For this one.
Yeah, no, for the prey it's okay, but for the virus it's in the other direction.
So, should we, can you go back one slide?
Yes.
Whenever we see cycles and observe them in nature, should we always assume that there's some delayed feedback on it, or can there be other drivers?
That's a very good question. And I will answer it a bit later.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll see. This is another section just after, but I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so basically, the more steps there are, the more delay there is, and the more these indirect feedbacks are likely to be stabilizing, to stabilize the dynamics. So basically, we show that the direct self-repellation is destabilizing a little bit, but if the feedback goes through 2 species or 5 species for longer times, it is going to be more destabilizing. It is more likely to be destabilizing.
It's always like that, or can you think of an example in where you have like more circles and the feedback is stabilizing?
Well,
They're all fast.
yeah, they're all super fast and...
Not always negative, yeah. You could imagine in principle.
But we will see a bit later how to compare feedback strength, basically, and which feedback is the most important. So, yeah, basically, if you have, well, I will explain this later, but if you have this feedback, but also a very strong, direct and quick feedback on the species, then it will be this feedback that will be the most important. So it can be stabilizing, even if you have feedback with delay. And also, very classical example of a negative feedback with delay is a prototype interaction. So I guess we've already talked about that, and maybe you knew it before, but a classical example is the Arctic hare and the lynx, which show strong selective dynamics. Basically, here there is a delay because it goes through the prey. And we can have also even more complex behavior, so chaos. I don't know if you know what is chaos or not, everyone. Maybe someone can explain, maybe someone knows. So basically, chaos is like unpredictable dynamics, so the dynamics are very, very sensitive to initial conditions. So here we have the dotted curve and the full curve. They start from very similar conditions, but a little bit different. And at the beginning they are the same, but at the end here you can see that they become like chaotic, basically. So they are not similar, and it goes in every direction. This is something that usually we study it with the logistic map, you know, and when you do the bifurcation diagram and stuff like that. So you change a bit like the initial condition, and then you have a lot of different trajectories and reflection diagram. You know that? Yeah.
But it's still a deterministic system.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. There's no random.
Sorry, the logical direct example for the hair and the length.
Yeah.
That's not really a delay differential equation though. It's like, what do you mean exactly by delay? Like,
So what I mean by delay is that the feedback of the links on itself go through the prey. So here basically, and because the prey has its own dynamic that is not super fast compared to the predator, if we compare to the virus, then the feedback of the predator itself will be delayed. Because like if you look at so here for instance, the hair is very, grows in abundance, so the lynx grows too, and then so it eats a lot of hair, so the hair starts decreasing, and there's a delay, then the link will decrease.
yes, but if you go back to the equations you had at the beginning,
The beginning.
what, this one?
This one?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it doesn't really depend on the state of the system at the previous step, it's the current state.
Yeah, so it's not explicitly in the equation, but still, the more it goes through different species, the more it takes time to come back to the species we are talking about.
The point is you could effectively take your two-species system and replace it by a single-species system looking only at the predator, but now with a delay. Okay. In a sense, you can treat the other species as a kind of memory in the equation of only the predator, or you see what I mean?
If we model the two, then the delay is like implicit.
Question.
Yes.
Is there a special implication of chaos dynamics in ecology?
So yeah, we will talk a bit later also about that. We don't see chaos that often, I think, in natural communities.
Yeah, if I may, actually, it's extremely debated.
Yeah.
There have been many papers saying chaos is everywhere, chaos is nowhere. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's no intermediate position.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I will show a bit like morphoparators prey cycles that it's also debated whether there are a lot or not of those exotic dynamics, but yeah, there are some trends. There is a graph about that, but for chaos, yeah, we didn't go into too much detail about that, but yeah, it's.
Yeah, I think it was coming back to this point afterwards.
Yeah. Okay, so now we'll talk about the importance of feedback strength. So this goes back to your question. So we talked about two species, but usually in a more complex dynamics there are more than two species, and so there are a lot of different feedback loops. So there is the feedback loop of one species on itself, that's the first one we looked at when a species was alone. But then there is a feedback loop, for instance, with the species with the virus, then with its prey, and then with the prime producer. I mean, the feedback goes through the prime producer and the herbivore and comes back to the predator. And so here this is more delayed than this one, and even more than this one. Okay? And so then there are all those different feedback loops. Some are direct, some are indirect. What are the consequences for dynamics? How can we know whether it will be stabilizing or destabilizing? And so this goes back to your question and to yours too. So yeah, how common are complex dynamics? So they are not seen everywhere. This is a graph of the fraction of periodic according to latitude. So here it increases latitude, so there are more oscillations at higher latitude. So basically in simpler systems, like in Arctic communities, it is assumed that there are more cycling dynamics. So basically, one example is the Arctic hare and the lynx. They are Arctic hare, so basically it's found in the Arctic. I will also give another example on the study system where I work on Bidot Island, which is in Nunavut also, so in the Arctic. There are big cycles of lemmings, and we don't really understand very well why, but the same, there are weasels, there are lots of different predators, and they are really huge. Sometimes, for some summers, you can't see any lemmings, and in other summers, there are like a shitload of lemmings everywhere. And but it's not clear whether there are a lot or not of those cycle dynamics. One paper, so this paper, showed that there were only 29% population cycles, and this might be a max cap because it might be overestimated. And more complex dynamics, so chaos, appear even less common, but some people say it's common. So well, it's a bit of a mess.
Just a short question about the cycles in Arctic ecosystems.
Yeah.
I just wonder how much of these cycles are linked to the. I mean, Arctic ecosystems are basically built on cycles because you have snow in winter, so you have no primary production. So the basic functioning of the ecosystem is a cycle. So I mean.
But why do we need to cycle? Because of the seasons?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not this. I mean, you can have cycles without seasonality, basically.
Yeah, that's a question. I mean,
Yeah.
do you observe much more cycles in the interaction between organisms in places like Arctic where there is a strong cycling at the basis compared to, for example, tropical places where the cycle is much less limiting?
So that's what this graph is saying, basically. Yeah. But actually, this is I'm working on that, and so I'm trying to see from the community on which I'm working whether it is the seasonality that is driving the cycles or the interaction with the species. But you can definitely have cycles without seasonality.
Yeah.
And then seasonality is. It really varies how you take it into account in your equations. So it can be just a change in parameters, can be migratory species and resident species, and
Yeah, I wanted to make the point that part of the problem is high latitude ecosystems are both much simpler, like much fewer species,
yeah.
and also much more periodic in environments. So it's hard to disentangle what of the two are important. But for instance, the lemming cycles, they don't have they have a period of several years. So it's not just a period of forcing. It could still be created by the forcing side. It's not obvious, right?
But there are, I mean, that's what people say that it is still caused by predation. And, I mean, there's a big debate whether living cycles are bottom-up or top-down. But some people really think it is top-down. I mean, with the team with whom I'm working, think it is top-down. But
No choice.
yes.
You say that 29% are population cycles and that complex dynamics are less common. So what is the rest made of?
Stable dynamics.
Just, yeah, stable.
I mean, of course, or this is the other example. Yeah, well, either stable, of course, there is also, there could be random processes or whatever. It doesn't mean it is completely flat, with no variation. But you can also observe cycles that are not driven by internal dynamics. So this is also Seth gave an example of that. And so here this is ungulate species with the dots and with the full line. And this goes back to also maybe your questions, I don't remember. But so this is a rainfall pattern. And so you can see that here the variation of the species of the abundance really follows the rainfall patterns. So you can also observe cyclic, I mean it's not really cyclic, but it's weird exotic dynamics. Yes. Okay. Because
I also have a question. Is there, like, when it comes to defining cycles, is there a temporal limitation on what we say, well, if it's over X amount of years, you can't possibly expect a cycle? Because, like, we usually were limited in terms of the length of our data set, but in reality, if we're thinking at a species level, we have to think about when it branched off. Maybe a cycle is on the century level, or a cycle is on 500-year
guess that if it's 500 years, we will never see it, so we cannot really know if it's, we cannot, but there are cycles of 10 years, for instance. It is possible, and some people say it is cycle. Then it's hard to know if the species, I guess what it can be hard to know if the species went to extinction and just recolonized, or if it stayed at very low abundances and then it grew again. Like on another site in the Arctic, there are also living cycles, but much longer. And I think it's 10 years. But the thing is that because no one goes there in winter, it's hard to know what's happening in winter, basically. So, but but for some species, you can guess like that there is no new colonization, because if you are on an island, for instance, the species just cannot cross. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, then I don't do you have any?
Opens about 10 more.
Actually, I don't know, for 500 or years, would we call that a cycle?
I'm shooting from the hip here, but I feel like, if we're defining cycles, it should be probably a direct relation to the longevity of the organism we're interested in. But I haven't really, humans live up to 90, 100 years versus a lemming. Should we expect different cycle optimums or ranges given the longevity?
But like a lemming, I'm not sure how many years what's the longevity, but it doesn't, I don't think it's a lot. Like maybe, I don't know, 3-4 years maximum, and still, if there are like 10-year cycles, people still call that cycles. Or they're wrong, maybe. And so how can we know whether there is, when the feedback are important and which feedback is important? So basically, if there is no complex internal dynamics, so if like the dynamics are stable, the strongest feedback is probably negative and fast. So this feedback is probably the strongest. So not necessarily this one, but the feedback has to be fast and negative for a dynamic to be stable. And so to give an example of how self-regulation acts on the Lotka-Volterra equations, here we have the abundance of the prey and the predator for weak prey self-regulation, weak predator self-regulation, and strong prey self-regulation and strong predator self-regulation. And so here you can see that both prey self-regulation and predator self-regulation are stabilizing the dynamics. Okay, so this means that here with a strong if we are focusing on the predator with a strong here negative and direct and fast feedback, this is stabilizing the dynamics. Okay. And so this is just the answer to the questions that I already said. So when there are a lot of different feedbacks, what will determine the overall dynamics of the community is the one that is, those imposed by the strongest feedback loop. So if it is fast and direct, it will be stabilizing, but if it is like delayed and negative, still you can have cycles. Okay. Yeah. So for that, we need to be able to find a way to compare those feedbacks, basically. And this goes back,
Sorry, to interrupt.
No?
Is it always the case that there is a single feedback that is dominant, or don't you have examples where there are two feedbacks that are equivalent?
Yeah, I will show that later, but basically for cycles, you don't have that, I will show that, but there is a mutual control. So the direct feedback are weak compared to, it's always a comparison. So I guess there is always a little bit of this negative it's super hard to quantify also the self-regulation. Actually, we have really, really poor data on that. I mean, because it's not like, I will also explain that later, but it's not like a yes or a no, it's always quantification, so it's always relative to other feedbacks. And so, yeah. But you can have cases where the negative and direct feedback is very weak compared to the indirect feedbacks. And so to go back on the first lecture of today, so when can we apply the niche concept? So basically, the niche works when the other species can be modeled as imposed conditions, and it fails when there are feedbacks. So Arnaud explained that already. And so in which case can we, because if there are always feedbacks, I mean, in which case can we apply the niche concept? So basically, either, Arnaud also explained that a little bit, either it is at short term, so before the feedback starts, or at long term, only if the indirect feedback here is negligible compared to the direct and fast feedback. So if we are looking at the predator here.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So when can we, for instance, when could we do like species distribution models, or when could we use the niche concept? It's basically either at short term, so I will then give the mathematical explanation of that, maybe it will be clearer after, or at long term, but only if the feedback here of the predator on itself but through the prey is negligible compared to the direct and fast feedback on the predator on itself. So this is exactly what I just explained. It's always relative to other feedbacks. And so if this one is much stronger, it will, yeah, then you can ignore the feedback through the other species. Yeah. I will explain a bit more, showing how, I mean, how we can explain that in the equations, and maybe it will be clearer. Okay?
The solid line in the right. The negative
This one?
circle? No, the circle, the negative.
Here?
Yes.
Yes.
Is the dependency is dense dependency?
Yes, yeah, exactly. This is like the self-regulation. So for instance, this one will eat the cubs of other males of its own species.
This dense dependency also depends on the resources. So at which way all the dashed lines are affecting.
Yeah, I mean, this will, the indirect feedback will impact the abundance of
the lines.
but here it is very negligible compared to the direct one. So we could, yeah. So we could even say that it's
the sum of all the long-term feedbacks, perhaps that it is affect or the solid. I don't know how to call
self-regulation here?
Yes.
So it's not directly affecting self-regulation, it is affecting the abundance of this one. But if this one is much less strong than this one, then what will affect the abundance is really its own self-regulation.
But self-regulation, what happened? And why it is happening?
This is like with the examples I gave. Here, for instance, this, but there are a lot of different mechanisms that can lead to self-regulation. Okay. So it's quite complex, and I will explain a bit later. Here I talked really about direct self-regulation. Then there are a lot of other processes. It's basically whatever I would cause density dependence.
But that is not affected by the competition for resources.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in a sense.
Not only.
Yeah, it will be maybe clearer later, but in a sense the point is that if a resource is not part of the strongest feedback, I mean, no, yeah, sorry. Okay. The point is, it could be that the very strong, very fast feedback actually is going to a different resource, right? The point is that any resource that is not part of that stronger feedback is something that you can treat just as part of a niche.
Okay.
Or if you want to put it a different
Well,
way.
this is
If you want to
here.
put it, yeah. Maybe if you come back to the previous slide, sorry. It could be that this negative feedback on the left comes from those things eating much faster things like rabbits or something. And that's how they self-regulate. And since this is really fast, it counts as self-regulation.
Yeah.
Whereas the one on the right is not fast, it's maybe like,
Yeah. Yeah, because like you have to see I mean, I will show that a bit later, but self-regulation is depending on different axes. You can see a kind of a continuum of self-regulation, and the fastest and the more direct it is, the more it would be stabilizing, and the more we call it direct self-regulation. But yeah.
Is there such thing as a feedback-to-feedback interaction?
Sorry?
If you have two feedbacks that are interacting, is there a term for that?
I don't think so.
no, that's very, we always decompose.
Yes. And so if we take an extreme case, so when this direct self-regulation dominates, so all the other interactions here, we can ignore the feedbacks, and they can be part of the niche, so they can be modeled as part of the niche. So maybe this is going to be a bit clearer now with the mathematical illustration. So we'll show how the interaction with other species contribute to both the niche and the feedback with the Lotka-Volterra equation. So we take two species Lotka-Volterra differential equations. So here we have the prey species, which is the 1, and the predator species, which is the 2. So recall that if the prey abundance, if the prey is alone, its abundance at equilibrium equals R over A. So here A is the self-regulation. And so here we have the interaction terms. And here we have a self-regulation for the prey and a self-regulation for the predator. Is that okay for everyone? Yeah? Okay, great. And so at equilibrium, dn1 over dt and dn2 over dt equals 0. And if the two species coexist, then we can solve for the predator. We have the abundance at equilibrium equals minus m2, so here m2 is the mortality, plus the interaction with the prey over the self-regulation with the predator, and here the interaction with the prey and the self-regulation of the prey. I will decompose this more clear. So, if we compare the prey alone here and the predator with the prey, we have, like in green here, this is what will define the growth rate of the prey, and here this is the feedbacks. Okay. And so if we plot that, the same plot as what I showed before, but so here the net growth rate according to the abundance. So here the feedback is given by what is at the, how do you say already?
Denominator.
At the denominator, thank you. So here we have the self-regulation, and this is the feedback through the prey. Okay, and what's interesting, again, just if the predator is alone, it just dies. No, but just to compare with the prey alone, here the predator is alone, you will have a negative feedback that is equal to its self-regulation. But basically, the predator alone just cannot survive because it doesn't have anything to it. Yeah. So we cannot really plot that, but it's basically the same thing as for the prey.
So
yeah.
So why is the growth rate defined per capita? Maybe it's a stupid question, but so
why do we plot this?
Yeah, instead of just variation through time, or why do you divide by n2 in that case?
Well,
yeah, I would say
just to have the equilibrium equation.
I would say it's really part of how people think of how do we arrive at the logistic. We start from the exponential, then we say the growth rate R in the exponential, you replace it by a linear function abundance. So it's really
so you divide by n to have the growth rate.
It's density dependent R, And that's always what we're plotting. It's always this density dependence R that we're plotting. Because there's this idea that the baseline is exponential growth, right? So always what matters is kind of what is the effective multiplication, like how many offspring you have. And this is plotting how many offspring you have, or how many offspring are surviving. See what I mean?
Yes. That has more to do with the way you do the model.
But this goes back to the first lecture.
Exactly, yeah. It's also that deep down, the driver of population dynamics is always that there is this kind of exponential engine behind things, and then it's modified by everything else. Right? The growth of the exponential is what is modified by everything else.
Yeah.
And at first order, you approximate it by a linear function of the rest.
Another question, sorry. So, from the plot, so you have this feedback A11.
Here?
Yes. I think that should be the self-regulatory feedback for the prey. Huh?
This is the feedback of the prey, and this is the self-regulation of the prey, A11.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's very interesting to I mean, I don't know if that's your question, but here, noticing that the feedback of the prey depends on the self-regulation of the prey is very important. I will go back to that later, but yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So it depends on the interaction coefficient here and on the feedback of the prey on itself. And so yeah, if we interpret this, so here we have the sum of the abiotic and biotic contribution to the niche, so the growth and the mortality, the growth here and mortality here. And here this is the sum of the direct and of the indirect negative feedback. So just like here we have A to 2, and then it is the product of the two interaction coefficients over the self-regulation of the prey. Yeah? And so this goes back to your question, Leo. Basically what's important here is the relative how A to 2 will be strong compared to the negative feedback here. And so basically we can ignore in the indirect feedback if the direct self-regulation A to 2 is much stronger than the feedback. And in that case, what's important in the equilibrium abundance of the predator is just the growth here and its own self-regulation. And so in that case, we can apply the niche concept. Yeah? And yeah, what's important is that we see that the indirect feedback depends also on the self-regulation of the prey, of the species. And so this has consequences for who controls who in a community. So we will now show what are the consequences here for what really determines the equilibrium abundance of every species. So if we go back to the original Volterra, so here without self-regulation, so you can see that there is no A11 and no A22 here, and so this can lead to cycles. And so here, the predator abundance, so if we solve at equilibrium, the predator abundance, the equilibrium equals m over A12. That's the prey, sorry. The prey, because it's the prey abundance equals m over A12. So it is set by the predator mortality. And here the predator abundance equals R over A21. So it is set by the prey growth. So here, if there is no self-regulation, the equilibrium abundance of the species is not at all influenced by the traits of itself, but by the traits of the other species. Yeah? And yeah, this is a bit counterintuitive, but there are two important things to take into account when we want to understand how the dynamics is how strong are the interactions, A11 and A12. This will define how much does dynamics of one species depend on the dynamics, on the current abundance of itself and the other species. And then to know who controls who. This is really at long term, so what will influence the abundance n at long term. Okay, so whether it is determined by the other species or not. Is that clear?
I'm just put that a few minutes so I can read. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I can. I will give an example after. I mean, a more figure. I will explain that a bit better.
I noticed that this is something that comes back in later lectures also. It's very important. This idea that how much, like, species, they appear both as their abundance and as their dynamics. You can ask, does the dynamics of one species depend on the abundance of another, and does the abundance of one species depend on the dynamics of another? And those two are valid questions, but they're not the same questions.
And in the competition and the multi-trophic lectures, we will talk more about that.
And ninja sexual.
Ninja sexual.
From what you just said, dynamic is the rate of abundance, so the rate.
Yeah.
The variation.
So that's the thing, it's that there's this kind of, that's true, but at the same time, you're a physicist, right, Shane? No? Yeah. So given the position and velocity, you can treat them as two independent variables. And it's a bit of the same idea here, it's that the dynamics, basically, it's the thing where, let's say, the growth rate or the mortality or the traits of the species appear. It's the processes, and the abundance is the pattern, in a sense. So a process can affect the pattern, and the pattern can affect the process, you see, and it goes in both directions, right? You can ask how much is the pattern of one species affected by the processes of other species, and how much are the processes of one species affected by the patterns of different species. And both are valid questions, but they're not the same question, which makes it very confusing when you ask how strong is an interaction, or how important is one species for another, because it could be important for its dynamics,
but not for its
equilibrium, for instance. Here, for instance, in this previous example, clearly a species is important for its own growth, but at equilibrium, you don't see it at all. And like its equilibrium is completely defined by the other species.
Yeah, basically, if the prey has no growth rate, it will not grow. But at equilibrium, its abundance equilibrium really doesn't depend on its growth rate at all. Yeah, that's a bit. It's clearer. And so we will go back to that in other lectures too. But basically, if we take to know who controls who, if we take two species, there are four possibilities. So resource control here, both abundance are controlled by the prey dynamics. So basically, the way to think about it is that the species that will experience less self-regulation will control everything. I mean, but so here, if you have self-control, both species have a strong self-regulation. So both species control its own abundance. I mean, each species controls its own abundance. Then, if we have mutual control, so this goes back to Leo's question. If both self-regulation are very low, I mean, not very important, there is mutual control, so each is controlled by the other, and this creates cycles or chaos. And we can have consumer control if the self-regulation of the predator is very weak and the self-regulation of the prey is stronger. So whichever species has less self-regulation changes until it fixes the other. Okay? And so you can see that also in here. This basically depends on the relative value of the coefficient here. But this will go back because this is true also, I mean, not the resource and the consumer, but this is true also for competition and for other type of interaction, and so we will go back to it in the coexistence lecture.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, so, but it pops up everywhere, so don't worry. hopefully over time it will.
At the end of the week.
For example, in the case of resource control, so if it is the scenery, it's expected that the strength of interaction, the blue interaction, is low.
Yeah, so there is the arrow because the predator will always depend on the prey. Because in any case, if there's no prey, the predator just dies.
There are no other preys to feed.
Yeah, no. Here there is only those two species.
Okay.
Yeah.
And still, the self-regulation could be strong.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Yeah.
But you think it's common, or I don't.
Resource control. Lots of people think that the whole world is bottom up. And is that true? I'm not sure. I think it's always. Yeah, I don't think it's like. From what I have. Sorry, Stephen, I will go back to your question. From what I starting to work on my food web, for instance, is that the more species you have, it cannot be only top down or only bottom up. It's always a question of the relative feedback, strength, and because there are all those loops. It's it's hard to be like either. Maybe in some systems, but there are purposes that are really bottom up.
The problem is.
Phytoplankton and stuff like that.
Yeah, the problem is that bottom up can mean either resource control or self control. So that's why.
Also. Because you always have a bottom up effect, because the prey always need the predator always need a prey. Even if you have self control here, lots of people call that bottom up actually.
Yeah, I would say that probably this kind of like a situation, the situation that people have in mind where, if you don't reintroduce the wolf into Yellowstone, then the herbivores will go crazy and destroy everything. It's a bit this top left situation. And that's weird, right? Because then concretely we would call that resource control, even though it feels like it depends on whether the consumer is regulating stuff, actually. So no, I don't know. Basically, you can imagine all four in the world, and it's very hard to know in advance. I think it's all that.
And here we focus on just two species, but in the next lecture, there's a multi-trophic with more species, and then just lecture. I'm not sure he will talk about that.
Not directly.
Not directly, but he will talk about complexity in larger networks. Thank you. Anyway, just one last point on that is that the fact that this is a bit counterintuitive, that self-regulation here is important even if it's a resource control, but this goes back to here where you know that you can see that it depends on the self-regulation of both species. Okay, so this is already, if this one is strong compared to this, or if the self-regulation of the prey is strong compared to the others. Maybe I already said it.
But from the, so one step back. Yeah, so for the resource control, from what I can see, so like this self-control for the predator, it's negative and strong. Then you could use the niche framework or whatever.
No, because the feedback is still important here. You can use the niche here. This just for the self-control. But usually the niche is focused on only one species. So that's the problem. Like you can take one species and think that there is no feedback. Here you can apply the niche for the predator and for the prey, because it doesn't really depend on the other species. In the three other cases, you could not.
So it's true that in a sense, if there is any species that is very outside of the niche framework, it can destroy the niche framework for others, potentially, right?
Yeah.
Because there can be strong feedbacks to that other species. And so yeah.
But then, obviously, if in this case this is much stronger than this, and the feedback, then you could potentially apply the niche.
Okay, so the figure doesn't really represent a case where the self-regulation is stronger. So I just want to be clear on that. So this is not what the figure is saying. So the figure is not trying to tell us that the
dotted because it's indirect feedback, but it doesn't mean that this one is stronger than this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, if the feedback, if the self-regulation of the prey is 0, then since the indirect is divided by self-regulation of prey, it's always going to be larger. Than no matter what the self-regulation of the predator is, it's always going to be.
That's my thinking.
Yeah, because the more you divide by something small here, the more the indirect feedback will be strong. Will be
yes. So this saying that these 4 outcomes are possible. Just looking at the relative values on the parameters. Is it?
Can you repeat? Sorry,
like all 4 outcomes are possible from the model. Just looking at the values of the parameters that are involved.
Yes.
So does it imply that if like a system is like a bottom-up control, it will never switch over to be like a top-down control?
Yeah, it can because it depends on if the parameter change.
Okay.
Yeah.
But generally it wouldn't change, right? Or it depends on like environmental context.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if there is this is debatable. If the parameter change, does the attack rate of a species change through time or not? In models, usually they don't, but they could. I guess they could.
Yeah, if you can give one example, maybe you can think of this hypothesis for invasive species. So if what makes them invasive, grow big, is that, for instance, they don't have viruses and pathogens in their arrival environment, you can think of that as a weakening of the past negative feedback. So it might be that if in a different environment, then the direct loop is, or what serves as a kind of effective direct loop, direct negative feedback, is weaker, and then you can move from something that was very, bottom-up, very gentle in its own environment, to something that is very top-down in a different environment.
Or if seasons, for instance, there is seasonality and the parameter change, then you could switch from bottom-up to top-down, or you could.
But this will never depend on the abundances of the children that are in the model, right?
Well, indirectly it depends on the abundance because, not the equilibrium, but the process.
Yeah, but so I think here there's a tricky point. In local Terra, it's just the parameters. If you have more non-linearities, it might be a bit more subtle.
And so just a synthesis for that. So basically, to apply the niche viewpoint, self-regulation dominates all of the loop, and so then you can put the virus and the prey in the niche. But if you have complex dynamics, the feedback loops are important. So yeah, this is what I said already many times. So stable equilibria and super dynamics, you can apply the niche viewpoints only when self-regulation dominates. And any other kind of positive or delayed feedbacks can create complex and exotic patterns. And so now we will talk a little bit about mutualism. So we will leave, we still talk about this feedback, but we'll focus a bit more about mutualism. So maybe the people who work, I've never worked on mutualism, so you can tell me if I say wrong things or if you want to complete what I'm saying. So mutualism will give a positive feedback, and this can lead to a runover process if the regulation is not sufficiently strong. But mutualism is less likely to be open to general theory. So I said that there was a lot of focus on protocol interaction and not so much on mutualism. So why? So basically, you cannot get much with plus links. This will only give you plus and plus make plus. And I already showed examples that runover processes they are quite sensitive. And most relevant mutualism processes are nuanced and particular, so they are all different. And so with competition, with management relationship, this will be the case of lecture 4, we can have also positive relationship. With exploitation, we can have a lot of different things, but with mutualism, we will only get varying degrees of positive relationship. And this is a quote of Mathieu. Basically, when everyone helps everyone else, you boil down to a single variable, model with behavioral dynamics, just a total abundance. It's as if we don't really care about the different species, just total abundance helping itself. And some people think it's not very interesting. So I mean, at least Yuval, because this lecture was given by Yuval, who is not here this year, and he said it wasn't interesting. But anyway. So why don't we see a lot of mutualism on our processes? Basically because mutualism is not necessary for on a process, so exponential growth will also explode very quickly. This is the example I gave. So a true mutualistic on our processes will likely change the role of the game. So for instance, humans and technology, basically what I call a change in the game rules is just evolution. So in an evolutionary context, it's very more common, but in effect, it will simply lead to more complex organisms, not to more complex communities. Okay. And superorganisms are not very obvious, so this could suggest that this is not very common. And so, yeah, mutualism can be seen as less limitation. It's not like something that will increase something, it's more something that will less decrease something. So basically, ectomycorrhiza will lead to less natural limitation, and seed dispersal could lead to less dispersal limitation. I already said that is difficult to measure. So not only are many interactions limited in scope, but unlike trophic interaction is not easily quantifiable. And in a competition, it involves functioning in different species, which makes harder to make experiments. Empirical work. And that's it for mutualism.
Yeah, I would like to specify, especially for people working on mutualism,
Yeah.
that I think the point is, it's hard to have a general theoretical understanding of mutualism that says something new and general. It seems that to say something new, you have to be more particular.
Yeah. Focus on particular mutualism.
Or the kind of models that we use in population dynamics are not just the interesting way of looking at mutualism. Basically, it's not the right prism to say something really deep or interesting about mutualism. You have to think about something deeper, like more mechanistic, maybe about what is the limiting factor, how do you remove that limiting factor from mutualism.
It's more interesting to focus on the evolutionary dynamics.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the places, for instance. It's one of the places where typically many people interested in mutualism, they would do instead game theory, public goods, these kind of things.
And also in network works, very interesting things to patterns that emerge from mutualistic interactions.
Yeah.
So it's in the structure, not really in the dynamics. The
Okay,
dynamics are a bit basic,
yes,
but the structure is interesting.
Except maybe if you mix mutualism with other interactions.
Yeah.
But then, even, I don't know, could you just neglect mutualism? Or?
No, I mean, for instance, I think in the example that Matthew Leibold gave of Sonia Kefis.
The network where they
network,
lots of different interactions.
Yeah, it's interesting to know that there's a mix of mutualism with something else. But yeah.
And so now I will just talk a little bit about abiotic interaction, because sometimes, so I focused on biotic interaction, but sometimes you can also have feedbacks with abiotic interactions. So one example is the ecosystem engineers. So an ecosystem engineer is a species that have a strong feedback with the environment. So they will strongly modify the physical environment, and typically they will improve it for themselves. So we also had a few examples with CEP. So one classical example are beavers. You know, the beaver, they create, river network, they create some habitat for themselves. There are also mangrove trees that can affect the water salinity, savanna trees that can promote albedo wildfires. Or here this is an example with, so I don't know what to say, plants and dryland, sorry. They want the surrounding soil to be more humid, and this can help plants and their vicinity. So here the abiotic environment is changed by the species in contrast to the niche lecture. And if we go back to the control, the four control possibilities, the first two, they are less likely because strong self-regulation of an abiotic factor is not common, but you can have consumer control and mutual control. Okay. So either consumer control, both are controlled by the species, and mutual control, each is controlled by the other, okay, with the abiotic factor this time. But it's the same idea with the species. And for instance, one example for plant-water interaction. So I don't know if you know vegetation patterns. Yeah. So here, this is, you can model this with the closed model, and with strong self-regulation, here there are no, the spatial profile is stable, so there are no pattern. But if you have only linear models and no self-regulation, this can create vegetation patterns. And so Yuval was worked on that. So yeah, that's an example of that he gave. Yeah. And so to finish, we'll go back to self-regulation and we'll show just some challenges and applications that are already a bit mentioned. So yes, what I said, like being self-regulated is not a binary yes or no, except for really direct self-competition. But we can classify various feedbacks by how much they can act as self-regulation. So what we will call direct self-regulation, we will call that canonical self-regulation. And then we can classify various feedbacks according to several axes. Today I will talk about 2 axes. And in your lecture, or yeah, in the coexistence lecture? Yes, we will introduce the 2 more axes. So basically, the first axis is instantaneity. So either the feedback is fast or delayed. So the more delayed there is, the less destabilizing the feedback is. And whether there are intermediaries. So whether the self-regulation is direct or indirect. And so the more indirect it is, the more risk there is that the feedback loop is broken when something else impacts the intermediary. And so this is just a little schema to explain. So when the self-regulation is direct and fast, this is a canonical self-regulation. And we can have extended self-regulation depending on the instantaneity and the intermediate, and if there are intermediaries, so for instance through other species. And so examples of that are, so here we have canonical self-regulation, and here the instantaneity. So basically, with light competition, this is almost instantaneous. Instantaneous. If you have consumer interference, it goes through other individuals, and disease, here it goes through a virus or a bacteria, and so it is more delayed. And here, for intermediaries, so if the process is consumer interference, there are no intermediaries. With light, the intermediary is abiotic, and with the disease, it goes through an abiotic intermediary. And so there is less chance that something, more chance that something will happen to the disease, for instance, here. And not to the disease, but to the virus or the bacterial disease. And so, yeah, I mentioned that already. So self-regulation is really hard to quantify because there are lots of different processes, and also because usually it is modeled implicitly. Yeah, it's not, and so it didn't really, even if it's super important and if people take it into account in models, it's not really explicit. Like there are no, there are papers on self-regulation and trying to quantify it, but yeah, it's hard. And even for 2 species, and even worse for a whole food web. And I don't know if you know this study of Barabas in 2017. So he looked at a food web in the Serengeti National Park here, and he tried to estimate self-regulation in this food web, and he showed that at least 50% of the species in this food web needed strong regulation for the stability of the coexistence and the stability in this complex food webs. So we can try to estimate self-regulation by taking, for instance, a food web. We know that the species are here, they coexist. We assume stability. This is, again, if we go back to sub lecture, we can discuss that, but still. And so for stability and coexistence, then at least 50% of species need strong regulation. And so here I guess it is strong self-regulation, direct and fast self-regulation. Yeah. And obviously if you want to know the indirect feedback loops and the indirect regulation, it's even much harder to quantify. And so just one example, I already talked a bit about that, but for my project, I'm trying to model the dynamics of the food web of an Arctic food web. So this is just some of the species, there are more species than that. But we have time series, like 30 years time series, so it's a lot. So we have a lot of data, and we know some of the parameters. I'm just using Lotka-Volterra equations, but we do not have any value for self-regulation, basically. And so, as I said, like lemmings are cycling, and so we want to try to better understand why they are cycling. But the problem is that I don't know anything about self-regulation, so I'm also trying to estimate self-regulation. So I know which species are in the food web, and I'm taking seasonality into account, and I'm trying to estimate self-regulation. But even with like time series, very long time series, even if I know all the parameters, especially for summer, not for winter. For winter we don't have a lot of parameters, we don't know anything. Even with that, actually, it's super hard to estimate self-regulation, because the more parameters you estimate, the more different combination of parameters can give you the same dynamics. So I can get more or less the same dynamic that stick to the data. They look good, it's the good dynamic, but with lots of different self-regulation values. So this is just an example of, in a research project, self-regulation can be very important if you want to understand the dynamics of food web.
So this is a very inverse problem then.
Sorry?
It's an inverse problem.
What do you mean by inverse?
Well,
yes, so I have like the dynamics and I'm trying to estimate the parameters.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because actually, I think that we do have more often abundances of the species. This is often what is measured.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, some people measure also attack rate or mortality or growth rate, but self-regulation. So basically, I'm trying to take all the information I can have, so abundances of species, time series, the parameter that I know, and I'm trying to estimate with that the remaining parameters.
Well, I was just going to suggest if you were to do this like in a Bayesian framework and you had like prior information on what you think those parameters are, would constrain it too much.
Yeah, this is what I'm doing in MCMC, so it's basically more or less the same. But even with that, the thing is that the more species you have and the more parameters you have, you can really have different combination of parameters that will give you the same dynamics.
Sure.
But the same dynamics, but not necessarily the same feedback loops, and so the same control.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if it's clear, but like for instance, so here you can't really see, but in gray it's the data, it's just for the lemming, and in colored line it's the simulation, and I have tons of different simulations like that stick quite good to the data. But for some, it's there is top-down control of the wizard on the lemming. For some other, there is a bottom-up control of the plant on the lemming, with the same dynamics. I mean, because it's like depend on all the species too. Yeah, on parameters. Yes.
These different results giving a big number of parameters. How much do you think it's just a picture of reality? That at some time this given set of conditions give this curve, and then the system changes and the parameter changes, but you still get if you get different solutions at equilibrium, it will also be that all of them are possible.
Yeah.
And they just succeed in time stochastically.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, completely. Then I guess it depends how much it varies. I'm not sure how. I don't think that a species can, I don't know, triple its attack rate, for instance, in a short amount of time. But you could have little variation on the parameters. Because here, for instance, I model winter and summer, and so I have different parameters for winter and summer. But you know, I have like a sharp change, like you go from summer to winter in one day, and basically it's not like that, like the temperature starts increasing. And this is even more true for ectotherms, that because I could, for instance, take into account the temperature effect on their growth rate. So I do that, but really with a sharp transition. But the growth rate could increase slowly, and this, of course, then can change the other parameters.
This means that if we start from the multiple possible conditions and the other criteria that which from a given position can we go to the other set for a given set of parameters, if possible, transit to the other one, or is it just impossible, and then the next one might be just mathematical artifact?
Yeah, but there are so many that I think it might be hard to know that. Yeah.
Maybe a question.
Yeah.
So the study before this.
Sorry?
So one slide back.
Yes.
Sorry to take
The Serengeti.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how the authors were able to make this conclusion in terms of methodology, how they were able to arrive at this. I don't know how much you know about this study.
So if I remember well, I guess he knew I guess it did the same as what I'm doing, more or less. But maybe he had more information, and so he knew the other parameters. I don't think he estimated, remember? I don't think he estimated all the parameters, just self-regulation.
So yeah, basically, he knows the matrix of trophic interactions.
Yeah.
He knows them because I think it's a allometric model or something. But anyway, he assumes that he knows all the attack rates between species. Therefore, all the interactions between species, and the only missing elements are the effects of each species on itself.
Yeah.
And then he asks, okay, for this to be a stable matrix, what does it take? How much do you need to put?
Yeah, he just estimates because he has if you know all the other parameters and you just estimate self-regulation, then it's easier. And then I'm not sure, like, he doesn't give precise value either, so maybe he had also different combinations, but just that what popped up is that at least 50% of the species need a strong self-regulation for stability. And
regardless of which species.
Yes. Then maybe this is something interesting also. That, for instance, I don't know. I had the intuition maybe that's wrong in every system, but that usually the top predator they have more stronger self-regulation. But yeah, I don't think that he goes into the details of which species have stronger self-regulation, or I don't remember very well. But this is, I mean, something I found interesting actually, and I want to look in my study whether there are patterns in self-regulation, like whether prime producers have less or
which traits are, which traits are related to have more.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because for some species it's quite hard to come up with a conceptual mechanism for direct competition, right? It's easy for lions to be fighting each other.
Yes, but for plants, competition for light,
Allopathy and parasites. I mean, it's really the point is self-regulation is not a mechanistic concept; it's a phenomenological concept. Right?
Parasites is already there.
That's the part. Yeah, that's
but if it's fast enough, it
it
behaves like direct self-regulation. So this is exactly what we were, and maybe it will be clearer with the 4 axes, but yeah, there are a lot of different processes that you can more or less relate to self-regulation, but they can be delayed or they can have intermediaries, and so that's why it's really hard to measure, because it's a lot of different processes can act like self-regulation.
For me, I compare it to, in physics, friction. No one knows in detail what's happening when there's friction. We just know, okay, there is this much friction, you can measure it. Yeah. But it's a phenomenological notion, it's not really a mechanism. Because many things are actually many things are acting at the same time to all contribute to this number. Right? And so the only thing that matters is when things really cannot be considered as this, right? When they really create strongly delayed feedback or strongly positive feedback, and then you need to treat them as an independent variable or not.
Yeah. Thank you, Mathieu. So, yeah, conclusion on self-regulation. So, this is just what I said. So, what we said, mechanistically can come from many different things, but the crucial idea is it derives from things that are specific, fast, and centered on the focal species or compartment. And phenomenologically, what matters from an aspect of community biology is how strong it is compared to other feedback. So it's always compared to other feedback, even if you don't know really from where it comes. And so just to wrap up, and then we can have lunch. So for the whole lecture, so we saw that species can modify their abiotic and biotic environment, so creating feedback on their own growth. The sign and the delay of the feedback determine the dynamics. The niche viewpoint can encompass any interaction that is part of negligible feedback compared to others. And when direct self-regulation dominates, there are no complex dynamics, so the niche viewpoint can apply, and this is when a species' own traits and preferences determine its abundance. Self-regulation is crucial yet hard to measure and define.